Years ago, while yet a cherished portion of Mexico, Texas was famous for its cattle. Individuals owned thousands, even tens of thousands, which roamed almost at will over the vast and fertile plains. The care of these was left to a few men and a crowd of Mexican boys from 8 to 20 years of age. For not much money could be paid in wages when the finest cow or fattest ox was worth but $2 or $3. After the annexation of Texas to the United States, the earlier drives of great herds of cattle were accompanied by such numbers of these boys that all the herders were commonly called Texas cowboys. Later on, they shortened it to the cowboy. The daily life of the cowboy is so replete with privation, hardship, and danger that it is a marvel how any sane man can voluntarily assume it. Yet thousands of men not only do assume it, but actually like it to infatuation. I doubt that there be in the whole world a class of men who lead lives so solitary, so exposed to constant hardship and danger as this. A large herd of cattle will be guarded by a number of men who have a common place for eating and sleeping, but they are never there together. Day and night, in good weather and bad weather, some of them must be with the herd. The men are divided up into reliefs, each relief being on duty in the saddle not less than 8 hours of the 24, and each individual having a specified beat, sometimes 8 or 10 miles long. Each relief must go around the whole herd, see that all are quiet and unmolested. The outside limits are carefully watched, and if any animal has strayed beyond them, their trail must be followed up, and the fugitives driven back to their proper grazing ground. Under ordinary circumstances, and when the herd is simply being held on certain good grazing ground with abundance of water, these duties are comparatively easy. But when the grass is poor and the water scarce, the animals stray continually, and great watchfulness and labor are required for their care. Especially is this the case in winter when the grass is covered with snow. Cattle in large herds are easily stampeded, becoming panic-stricken on very slight and frequently without provocation. Nothing so starts them as a plains norther, and they will fly before a severe storm of wind and snow, sometimes for incredible distances. These are the trying times for the cowboys. When a stampede occurs from any cause, every man must be in the saddle, follow the fleeing animals day and night, get control of the herd, and bring it back to its ground. The worse the weather, the worse the stampede, and the greater the necessity for the presence and activity of the cowboys. A terrible norther during the winter of 1880 stampeded many herds in southern Kansas and the Cherokee Strip, some of which made fully 90 miles to the south before getting under control. With and among them were numbers of cowboys with only the scantiest rations of bread and meat, with no shelter or bedding, and no protection from the terrible cold, except the clothing they happened to have on when the stampede was announced. For fidelity to duty, for promptness and vigor of action, for resources in difficulty, and unshaken courage in danger, the cowboy has no superior among men. But there is something in this peculiar life which develops not only the highest virtues, but the most ignoble of vices. It is not solitude, for the shepherds of the plains lead lives quite as solitary, and they are generally quiet, inoffensive persons. The cowboy, on the contrary, is usually the most reckless of all the reckless desperadoes developed on the frontier. Disregarding equally the rights and lives of others, and utterly reckless of his own life, always ready with his weapon and spoiling for a fight, he is the terror of all who come near him. His visits to the frontier towns of Kansas and Nebraska being regarded as a calamity second only to a western tornado. His idea of enjoyment is to fill himself full of bad whiskey, mount his Mustang, tear through the streets, whooping, yelling, flourishing, and firing his pistols until the streets are deserted and every house closed. Then, with a grim smile of happiness, he dashes off to his comrades to excite their envy by graphic pictures of his own exploits and the terror of the timid townspeople. Cattle stealing is a mania not confined solely to our Scotch ancestors. The frontier has many cowboys out of employ, many impecunious gentlemen who long yearningly for a herd of cattle. The waifs and strays of large herds, or even a considerable herd carelessly guarded, will suddenly disappear. Sometimes the herdsman and the cattle disappear together, and should the owner be absent, are likely to disappear for him for all time. In 1872, the owner of a considerable herd returned to his ranch in southeastern Kansas after a short absence to find his herd and herders gone. Taking the trail alone, he plodded west for more than 100 miles when he found about half his herd in the possession of a notorious desperado near where Learned City now stands. On inquiry, he found they had recently been purchased of a man who had gone still further west with the other half. Following on, he found the herd in charge of his reputed owner on the Arkansas River near Fort Dodge. The thief was the most notorious, bloodthirstiest ruffian on the frontier. After a terrible combat, the thief was killed, and the owner collected his cattle, returned with them eastward. Arriving at the ranch of the robber who had his others, he went to him and said quietly, "I have taken the scalp of your partner and got half of my cattle. I want to know if I'll have to take your scalp to get the other half." The terrified ruffian gave them up without a contest. It would seem that no class of men ever was so unfaithfully represented, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and in consequence of this, so wrongfully understood and unfairly judged by the people generally, as that of the old-time cowboy has been. And it is to be regretted that this class of Western pioneers was figured at this great exposition in a form so well calculated to lend support and to perpetuate the mistaken common notion that the general public has concerning these men. Of the typical cowboy, Mr. Emerson Hough, in his most interesting book, The Story of the Cowboys, says, "What was really the life of this child of the wild region of America, and what were the conditions of the life that bore him, can never be fully known by those who have not yet seen the West with wide eyes. Those who did not, but who looked superficially and superciliously, remembering only their own surroundings and forgetting that in the eye of nature one creature is as good as another, if only it prevails where it stands, where content was distorted views of that which they saw about them. Having no perspective in their souls, how could they find it in their eyes? They saw color, but not form, in these wild men of the wild country. They saw traits, but did not see the character beneath them. Seeking to tell of that which they had not seen, they became inaccurate and unjust. Dallying with the pleasant sensation of exciting themes, they became grotesque instead of strong in their handling of them. The cowboy was simply a part of the West. He who did not understand the one could never understand the other. Never was any character more misunderstood than he, and so thorough was his misrepresentation that part of the public, even today, will have no other way of looking at him. They see the wide hat, not the honest face beneath it. They remember the wild, momentary freaks of man, but forget his lifetime of hard work and patient faithfulness. They insist upon the distorted mask and ask not for the soul beneath it. If we care truly to see the cowboy as he was, and seek to give our wish the dignity of real purpose, the first intention should be to study the cowboy in connection with his surroundings. Then perhaps we may not fail in our purpose, but come near to seeing him as he actually was, the product of primitive, chaotic, elemental forces, rough, barbarous, and strong. Then we shall love him because at heart each of us is a barbarian too, and longing for that past, the image of whose heredity we can never eliminate from our blood. Then we shall feel him appeal to something hid deep down in our common nature. And this is the way we should look at the cowboy of the passing West, not as a curiosity, but as a product, not as an eccentric driver of horned cattle, but as a man suited to his times. Theodore Roosevelt, in his Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail, bears this testimony to the intrinsic character of the typical cowboy. It is utterly unfair to judge the whole class by what a few individuals do in the course of 2 or 3 days spent in town, instead of by the long months of weary, honest toil common to all alike. To appreciate properly his fine, manly qualities, the wild, rough rider of the plains should be seen in his own home. There he passes his days. There he does his life work. There, when he meets death, he faces it, as he has faced many other evils, with quiet, uncomplaining fortitude. Brave, hospitable, hardy, and adventurous, he is the grim pioneer of our race. He prepares the way for the civilization from before whose face he must himself disappear. Hard and dangerous though his existence is, it is yet a wild attraction that strongly draws to it his bold, free spirit. He lives in the lonely lands where mighty rivers twist in long reaches between the barren bluffs, where the prairies stretch out into billowy plains of waving grass, girt only by the blue horizon, plains across whose endless breadth he can steer his course for days and weeks, and see neither man to speak to, nor hill to break the level, where the glory and the burning splendor of the sunset kindle the blue vault of heaven and level the brown earth till they merge together in an ocean of flaming fire. In the late 1800s, most through travelers upon the Plains railroads seemed to regard the cowboy as a creature indigenous to the range country, the same as the antelope, the coyote, and the prairie dog, and were even more eager to catch sight of one of the species than they were to see any of those which went on 4 legs. The people had read about the cowboy, and so they had their ready-made notions as to what he should look like and how he should act. Therefore, they accepted any broad-headed, weather-beaten lounger around the railroad station as a man just in from the cattle range. If he happened to have a gun strapped to him and could be imagined to be wearing an expression of disappointment because the moment afforded him no occasion for unlimbering his artillery and furiously going into action, he was at once raised to the rank of a bad man cowboy, though he may never have seen a herd of cattle on the range, and his character and reputation may have been such that he could not have stayed longer than overnight in any cow camp in the country, and then only when he had pleaded distress and was kept under surveillance. Perhaps in no other occupation of men was the theory of the survival of the fittest more plainly demonstrated in practice than in the quick weeding out of the weaklings, of the visionary, and of the inherently depraved among those who undertook the cowboy life. The first to go were those physically unable to stand the labor and hardships of the range. The second, while physically strong, found the life so far different from what they had pictured it that they dropped out as they realized it was a daily routine of duty and work under a code of rules and customs which, though not having the form of statutory law, were in practice almost as rigid as the regulations of an army. For several years after the Civil War, a considerable number of the second class turned cowboys, but such men, as a rule, could not stay for long. In the close communion of the cowboy life on the trail and the range, where trust, faithfulness, and the spirit of brotherhood and mutual confidence had to be, a man inherently depraved was out of place. As a class, the cowboys were no such lawless being as they have so often been represented. They were hardy, fearless, and reckless products of the conditions by which they were surrounded, but not vicious as a body. Their life was one of hardship, isolation, and self-denial, yet through it all, loyalty to the interest of their employer was steadfast, and whatever might be the privations of their occupation, they met and endured them uncomplainingly. Very few of the noted Western desperados, professional man-killers, ever were cowboys or in any way connected with the range cattle business. These infested the ghastly frontier towns of the cowboy era, for the lonely life of the range was not to their liking. Truly it was a lonely life. On the great open ranges, the whole outlook soon became one vast, featureless, confusing impression, like that derived from the ocean. Moreover, the general aspect of the plains was, and still is, where the works of men have not disturbed it, one of sadness, even of melancholy. The land seemed to be grieving over something that was lost forever. Then there was the silence of it. This was unlike that of a mountain solitude and different from that of the sea. It was of a kind that does not submit to description. The effects of the atmosphere of sadness, of the loneliness, of the unbroken quiet of the vast stretches of the plains became oppressive, burdensome, maddening. No one familiar with them can understand what these effects were. They bore down upon the mind as would a heavy weight upon the body. And a torturing headache then kept company with a sense of exile. Under the burden of these depressing influences, men felt like crying aloud in feeble attempts to break the wall of silence and loneliness by which they were encompassed, and often they did so. In some instances, reason was dethroned, for it is a peculiarity of man that he can better endure almost any other condition than that of solitude. But recently, a case of insanity from these causes became personally known to the present writer. It was that of a young man engaged in sheep raising in Wyoming, whose unbalancing plainly was due to the depression effects of his solitary life on a lonely range. It is doubtful if ever there was a cowboy who did not, at times at least, feel the burden of these influences, and the cattle not uncommonly showed that even they were not immune. Is it any wonder, then, that the cowboy who went with the trail herd to one of the old wild and woolly cow towns, after months, maybe a year of such isolation as this, turned loose, as he called it, and even sounded the depths of the iniquities that dominated in these miserable places? Or need we be surprised when told that upon his more frequent visits to his nearest grisly hamlet, he took possession of the place and for a day or so run it to suit himself, or tried to? Need it seem strange to us that the attraction of such aggravations of vice and crime in the old Abilene and Great Bend City or Dodge City demoralized him and brought him low, though they made him a victim more often than they made him a terror? Have you ever had the experience of sudden relief from some mental strain? Have you had the eager feeling that follows the off-casting of a load that has bore you down? Or have you ever had the buoyancy of spirit that comes with a return from a sojourn in the wilderness to the haunts of your fellow man? If so, as to either, probably you may in measure understand how it came about that the cowboy, fresh from the loneliness of the range or from the drudgery of the trail, when he found himself in the midst of houses and people, painted the town in variegated colors and made a fool of himself generally, without necessarily having been a bad man at heart. While a trace of the savage element still lingers in the blood of most of us, the gregarious instincts of our species are so strong that we are likely to be impelled to celebrate in some way the end of any separation from our fellow creatures that circumstances may have imposed upon us. This is exactly what the cowboy usually undertook to do when he went to town. Perhaps our way of doing this would not be such as his was, but of the spirit and motive, probably there were very little, if any, difference. As Mr. Roosevelt remarked in his Ranch Life on the Hunting Trail, these wretched cow towns were places in which drinking and gambling are the only recognized forms of amusement, and where pleasure and vice are considered synonymous terms. The frontier towns of the West in the cowboy period also were products of the conditions that existed. A transformation was in progress. Civilization was pushing its way onward with the irresistible force of the prodigious glaciers that in distant past ages moved over parts of the same country. And as with these glaciers, its front was shoving ahead morainic mass, a conglomeration of human debris and of harsh forces of both mankind and nature. Coming from the haunting and oppressive solitude and silence of the plains into these places of disorder and vice, many of the cowboys behaved as if they were dazed by the change of scene and surroundings. They were no longer the reserved, self-repressed men of the range, but threw off all restraint and measured their enjoyment of their few days of freedom and revelry by the degree of uproar with which they proclaimed their presence. Besides such indoor dissipation as this, the cowboys, when in the cow towns, would indulge in open-air demonstrations not well calculated to add to the sense of security in others who were abroad on the streets. After loading up with poisonous whiskey, which was about the only kind sold on the frontier, a group of them would mount their ponies and put off at a gallop to shoot up the town. Tearing up and down, yelling and whooping and shooting here and there, or firing wildly into the air, they made themselves believe they were seeing something of life. They might ride into a saloon and up to the bar to call for more liquor, and while waiting for it, divert themselves by putting bullets through mirrors, bottles, and other glass furniture of the outfit, and so bring on a manie in which one or more of their number would suffer from the revolvers or shotguns of the exasperated keeper of the place and his partisans. Nevertheless, it was not these follies, wild and foolish as they were, and that dissipated every dollar of a season's wages, that characterized these cowboys as a class. After several days of such debauchery and frolicking, those who had engaged in these celebrations and had not found a permanent abiding place in the local Boot Hill turned their faces and their ponies rangeward and set out to resume the daily round of hard labor under conditions that were equally hard, if not harder, but in which faithfulness to duty and fidelity to their employers' interests were the foremost consideration. It was this willing faithfulness under circumstances which put it to the most trying tests that characterized the cowboy in filling the place that fell to him during the years in which civilization was forcing its way into and over the immense wild land of the West. However, not all these men took part in the orgies and debaucheries of the cow towns, or forgot themselves at other times in other places. There were many, even in the wildest and woolliest period, who steadfastly held themselves aloof, keeping their wits about them, saved their wages, and successfully became range stockmen on their own account in later years. Before the close of the period of the trail and the open range, the Western cowboys had developed traits, manners, and practices that might be said to have made them a separate class of men. A large majority were native-born Americans, but in their ranks there were many young Englishmen, Irishmen, and Scotchmen, together with some of German origin. But the life brought all so close together that those of alien birth hardly were distinguishable from the others after a few years. Their manner of living and the routine of their occupation were the same from Texas to Montana. Conditions then existing in the West were much the same over the range country from far south to far north, and so the influence of these combined to impress upon this remarkable body of men a sort of hallmark, a distinctive and not unattractive class stamp. For some 10 or 15 years after the Civil War, there was a considerable number of Mexican cowboys on the range, most of them being from the southern part of the country. There were skillful men in every branch of the work and did it well, but the standing objection to them on the part of the employers was that they were rough, abusive, and unfeeling in their treatment of the stock, and personally untrustworthy. Between these and the others, there seldom was any of the fraternal feelings, and usually the caste prejudice placed the Mexicans under great disfavor. From the start, a prejudice that was stronger among the Texans than among their brethren in the North. But with all of it, it was sufficient to make the combination a disagreeable one. Among these old-time cowboys, the Texans and those of Texas antecedents were the most efficient for all-around work in the range and on the trail. Nearly all of them lived and moved as if they'd been born in the saddle and had seldom been out of it since. They hesitated about doing anything outdoors on foot, and if they had to go but a few yards, they would mount their horses for the journey. A habit, however, that was but little fixed among the entire fraternity. While all cowboys had to be good horsemen, the Texan was, it would seem, as skillful and daring a rider as he could have been were he and his pony grown together. Of him, Sweet and Knox, in their book On a Mexican Mustang Through Texas, in which the only amusing side of life in Texas at that time is set forth, to say, the cowboy is a man attached to a gigantic pair of spurs. He inhabits the prairies of Texas and is successfully raised as far north as the 30th degree of latitude. He is in season all the year round and is generally found on the back of a small Mustang pony, wild and savage as a colt of the Ukraine. This fact has given rise to a widely diffused belief that the cowboy cannot walk, and he's often cited as an instance, a stupendous manifestation, in fact, of the wonderful workings of nature to adapt his creature to the circumstances surrounding them. It is argued that once the cowboy was a human being, a biped with ordinary powers of locomotion, but that during the course of ages, becoming more and more attached to his horse, and having gradually ceased to use his legs, these important adjuncts had been incapacitated for pedestrian uses. And thus, the cowboy and his pony have developed into a hybrid union of man and horse, an inferior kind of centaur. Some scientists, however, dispute this, as several specimens of the cowboy have been seen from time to time who, wandering into the busy haunts of man, have, under the influence of excitement and while suffering from intense thirst, been seen to detach themselves from their mustangs and disappear into business houses where their wants were attended to by a man wearing a diamond breastpin and a white apron. Yet, though this was proven beyond a doubt by several competent witnesses, it was acknowledged that the specimens alluded to walked, or rather staggered, with uneven and wavering steps. This, however, does not disprove the development theory. Between the cowboy's riding and the eastern man, who exhibits himself on horseback in city parks or follows the hounds, no comparison can be made. It is only to be contrasted. It would seem that a better rider than this cattle-guarding man of the plains never lived, and certainly his ease, litheness, and gracefulness in the saddle, contrasted with the usual trussed-up, apprehensive, and sometimes simian-like attitude of the park horseman, made the latter appear ridiculous. While the cowboy had an elaborate vocabulary of forceful adjectives at his command, he found himself unable to fully express the disdain with which he regarded the little padded saddle, or postage stamp saddle, and the short-hitched stirrups of the conventional rider. He would have none but a real saddle, and his stirrups hung just enough above the length of his legs to afford his feet a firm hold in them. When riding, he did not perch in his stirrups, but rested his body upon the saddle and kept it there without letting daylight show under him. And it may be remarked here, this continues to be the ranchman's mode of riding, as well as that of nearly all Western men who have had occasion to mount a horse. In his large and comfortable saddle, with its long hitched stirrups, the cowboy could do with ease and grace all that is possible to the conventional horseman, besides a multitude of things that the latter would not dare to attempt. The cowboy's garb added much to their picturesqueness of the eye of those who came from afar, and indeed it was picturesque. As individual tastes among them varied only as to details, their working costume was about the same in every part of the cattle country, excepting in winter on the central and northern ranges, when and where more bundling up was necessary. But everywhere from early in the spring until late in the autumn, their apparel was almost as much as the same as the uniform of a soldier of the regular army. In the period of the trails and the open range, the cowboys in the main were young men, grizzled plainsmen only occasionally appearing among them, and a regiment of them gathered promiscuously from Texas to Montana would have met Army requirements as to age, as well as appearing as uniquely uniformed body of cavalry. But considerations of the picturesque had nothing to do with the fixing the characteristic dress of the cowboy. This, like its wearer, was an evolution, a product of conditions that was adapted to the service it had to render, and its wearer had no thought of real or imaginary theatrical effects the combination might produce. The broad-brimmed, soft felt hat, with the brim turned up in front, was to him the most serviceable known form of headgear. And this, and his leather chaps or overalls, often of goatskin, tanned with hair on and the worn with the hair outside, were the more conspicuous features in the makeup of his working costume. His other clothing was such as he found ready-made in the clothing stores of the country towns. He wore a heavy, loose-fitting flannel shirt with a handy pocket or two in it, and a large handkerchief, usually of bright-colored silk, tied around his neck. His trousers, which were kept in place by a belt, never by suspenders, were tucked into the top of his boots. But the chaps came down full length over the trousers and boots and touched the ground, often dragging a little. His body covering was easy-fitting and free, but that of his feet was quite different. Here he would wear nothing but tight-fitting boots, the tighter the better in his estimation, and these boots must have very high heels. Their tightness and their lofty heels had a sort of crippling effect when he was upon the ground, and in walking he was sometimes with a kind of a toddling gait. However, as the cowboy seldom walked and never very far, his footgear, uncomfortable as it would seem to have been, never troubled him much. But in the cowboy era, the wearing of high-heeled tight boots, things that are only occasionally seen nowadays, was not confined to his fraternity. They were common then, and nearly every Western man wore them, and would have considered himself quite out of style with any other kind on his feet, especially when he was dressed up. It has been said that the high heel of the cowboy boots was for the purpose of keeping his foot from slipping forward through the stirrup and thus putting him in an ugly predicament should he be thrown by some mishap. But as many of them had leather hoods attached to the front of their stirrups to prevent this, hoods which sometimes were very extravagant in the consumption of leather in their making, and as all cowboys refused other than high heels, this explanation seems hardly to fit the case. However, their dress, including their favorite boots, was satisfactory to them, and as a whole was perfectly suited to their business and life. Their chaps were taken over from the Mexicans, but the rest of their apparel was developed by them along the lines of natural selection. The cowboy's strictly personal outfit was completed by the addition of a trustworthy revolver, usually of heavy caliber, that could be depended upon in emergencies to open a way for daylight through the bodies of hostile creatures he encountered, including those of his own species, and a pair of huge spurs that were rarely used up to their full capacity for stirring up a horse or for punishing him. In the times when the Indians made the cowboy's daily life that of a soldier in war, as well as that of a herdsman, a carbine or a short-barreled rifle also was carried slung to the saddle with the muzzle downward. And in those times, he often had use for this weapon of longer range. We should not forget that this pioneer, who is the mistaken belief of many people, principally is associated with scenes of rowdyism in the old cow towns, had, through many years in his career, to be a warrior of the plains, as brave as the bravest, while he was also the caretaker of other men's property. The cowboy's saddle was unlike that of most other horsemen, and among his personal belongings, his chief interest centered upon it and was pride of his heart. It was customary in most parts of the range country for him to provide his horse gear at his own cost, and his willingness to spend his hard-earned money for what he regarded as a fine saddle usually ranked itself into extravagance. For one that had struck deep into his fancy, he would eagerly give up his pay of several months and be happy with his acquisition until some crafty saddler brought out another that outclassed it in ornateness. The old-time cowboy saddle was a heavy, strongly made affair with both cantle and pommel or horn very high and with a large skirt. The high cantle would seem to have been no general utility or advantage, but the high and strong pommel was a daily necessity in his business, for it came into play in various ways. When he roped a rebellious steer and brought him up short, the cowboy's end of the rope was hitched around the saddle horn. When one of his herd or the cattle mired and bogged and he had to be helped out, he threw his rope over his horns, made his end fast to the saddle pommel, started his horse, and tugged away. And when a wagon became stuck, or when the team pulling it was unable to climb a hill without assistance, the rope fast to the saddle horn was the means of overcoming the trouble. Most of the saddles were provided either with pockets or small saddlebags for odds and ends of things, and a blanket or two, together with a few extra garments, were carried in a roll behind the cantle in the cavalryman's fashion. About the bridle there was nothing especially noteworthy except the heavy curb bit, which appeared to be a rather cruel contrivance, but which was necessary in most cases in controlling the kind of horses used in the trail in the open range. The Mustang, Bronco, or Cayuse, by whichever name the beast happened to be called, was not, as is popularly supposed, the cowboy's ideal of a horse. Our friend was a good judge of horses and was ambitious to become the owner of a fine one. For his work, he took the best he could get, but as with many others of the concerns of his hard life, he had to be contented to get along with what was available, to make the best use of the means at hand. The typical cow horse or pony was upon the whole well adapted to his place, being tough in constitution and inured to all the hardships of life on the open plains. In his lightness of foot and quickness of motion, he was far better adapted to his rough work in managing cattle than any other type of horse could have been. But as he fed on grass alone, he did not have the size for size, the main strength of the grain-fed farm horse. Hence the need of the old times for so many horses on the range in proportion to the number of cowboys. To each of the latter, according to the work in hand, there were from 6 to 12 horses to be used in turn. A circumstance in which is reflected the remarkable vigor and endurance of the man who rode them. These cowboys were absolutely fearless riders, and the breaking in and the management of their half-wild and, at the start, wholly rebellious steeds was a job that called for skill and courage. Within recent times, exhibitions of bronco busting have been made a popular form of entertainment for the public in several western towns, and the young men who have participated in them have shown the great skill and daring in conquering unruly horses. But this kind of business was almost a daily affair in the life of the old-time cowboy. It was only one of the things he had to do, and he did it without thinking much about it, or even dreaming that someday it would be made the means of commanding the applause of a multitude. There were horses in every old range outfit that were as ugly and vicious when threatened with the saddle and bridle as any that had ever been seen in the bronco busting contests, and some that were even more so, that became habitual fighters and pitched and plunged and bucked every time they were put under his saddle. But the cowboy of that period regarded an encounter with one of these merely as an incidental duty in the day's work. In the days of the open and free range, the cowboy often slept on the bare ground wrapped in his blankets, taking philosophically whatever sort of treatment the elements might be fit to bestow upon him. At other times, the dugout or the shack or the tent of an outlying camp afforded him some shelter. He ate his meals sitting on the ground at the tail end of the mess or chuck wagon that followed the movements of the herd, and his utensils in this service consisted of a tin plate, a tin cup, and sometimes a knife and a fork. His fare was as plain as his mode of life, but he found compensations for its lack of variety and the crudeness of his surroundings when, at table, in an appetite that had few equals and no superiors. Although he had thousands of cattle in his keeping, milk, cream, and butter practically were unknown to his commissary. Of the range country in the old times, it was said that there are more cows and less butter, more rivers and less water, and you can see farther and see less than in any other country in the world. Many of the cowboys became almost as well versed in sign lore as the earlier plainsmen, the traders, the trappers had to be. All manner of track, trail, and marks were to them data from which to draw conclusions. Some peculiar movement of the animal indicates the presence of some other animal in the neighborhood. By the course and even the feel of the wind, they forecasted changes in the weather. a broken limb of a tree, a crushed weed, the debris around a deserted camping place, the flight of a buzzard or other birds, there to the experienced cowboy, as they had been to the traders and the trappers, what sightboards and advertisements are to dwellers in settled communities. In recent times, the story writers have been turning to the cattle ranchers of the West for material, and their romances of the range have become very popular. But the conditions in which the characters in many of these tales are represented as living and moving are far from those which surrounded the cowboys of the free range and the old trails. The average modern-day ranch house is a comfortable home, generally speaking. The cattle graze unattended in fenced pastures, and the daily round of duties of the men in charge is much nearer like the routine on a large farm than the life and the work of the cowboys of the wild and open range. No matter how much there may have been of romance in the present-time ranch life, there was a precious little of it in the experience of the range herdsmen of a century or so ago. Of the cowboy of that period, and of his decidedly unromantic life and business, Mr. Andy Adams, author of The Log of a Cowboy and of other Western stories, himself one of the old brotherhood, says in a recent magazine article, to describe the rank and file of this once splendid army of horsemen is no easy task. The same ground has been thoroughly covered before by pen and pencil and under limelight and slow curtain. To take any other than the popular view of this swaggering type, girdled with guns and rigged in the supposed regalia of the range, is to invite censure. Does the cowboy deserve credit for being a fine horseman when his work required him to be such or abandon his calling? True, the occupation was one that demanded the strenuous and weeded out the weakling. But are there no other avenues in life today that require daring and courage to meet the emergency with promptness and dispatch? Yes, but not so many romantic, someone answers. Romantic? Ask any man who ever made a trip over the trail if he was ever caught on the plains in a rainstorm with no fuel but buffalo chips. Ask him how many days passed without being able to make a cup of coffee. And did he really enjoy saturated clothing and wet blankets, and how far from the wagon would a herd drift on such a night? Ask him if he ever worked in the north when every morning he shook the drifting snow from his blankets, and in the eye of a blizzard rode to turn a winter drift to cattle. If he answers in the affirmative, inquire further if he was ever lifted out of a saddle, benumbed with cold, and did he really feel the occupation was a romantic one? If still unsatisfied, ask him from a sanitary standpoint if there was anything that would beat spreading his underclothing on an anthill to remove the vermin. Yet, for all of this, and for much more too, his wages were not large enough to make him purse proud, nor did they warrant the open-handed generosity of his kind. The cowboy was not what most people now would look upon as a well-paid man. Around 100 years ago, in the times when the raucous and brawling cow towns were mazes of snares and pitfalls for him, many of his class were working for from $20 to $25 per month and keep, such as the latter was, though the experienced trailman was paid more for his services while on the trail. But the cowboy then required that his wages be in the form of hard money, a stroke of business sagacity that stood out sharp, almost comical, contrasted with the foolish recklessness that was characteristic of the brotherhood as a whole in spending the money. At that time, the Mexicans in the calling were content with even less, few of these receiving more than $12 to $15 per month, and found. These also did business with their employers on a gold basis, and with many gestures of suspicion and even of contempt repudiated a tender of paper money for any amount. In later years, the cowboy's wages moved higher notch by notch, and before railroads and wire fences had put him out of business, his pay ranged from $30 to $40 by the month in the gold basis currency of the land, with a keep that averaged much better than he had known in the earlier years. But this time, while he still was a generous soul, he had become much less reckless in squandering his money. For such money pay as that which is represented by the figures set down in the foregoing, the cowboy lived the life of which something is suggested in our quotation from Mr. Adams. For him, it had a fascination that is hard for us to understand. He braved the elements in the part of the country where their extremes are to be seen at their worst, or at all events where the condition made them seem to be at their worst. If you have ever been abroad upon the great lonely, grieving plains, far away from any sign of the presence of your fellow man, when a blizzard out of the north was sweeping in fury over the land, you'll recall the sense of utter desolation by which you were seized, the feeling of helplessness that bore down on you in the presence of such forces in such a situation. The howling, freezing wind drives swirling, blinding sheets of shot-like sleet and powdery snow that sting and smother and blot out all the world around you and wrap the hills and valleys in a winding sheet of ice. In the opposite season, when the sun might burn and burn in a cloudless sky, week after week, even month after month, withering and shriveling the grass, glaring the land with its shimmering, blistering heat, and wasting the water of the streams and pools into nothingness, the cowboy patiently still went on with his work and did the best that was in him. For a few dollars for a month of his time, services, and for his knowing how. He liked his work, took pride in it, and knew of nothing that would or could induce him to neglect it. When the rolling clouds of the summer tempest blackened the sky and the lightning flamed and crashed and roared, terrifying the hordes of beasts that was his keeping and startling them into dreaded stampede, he rode forth with no thought save that of doing his duty, though he knew that death, in a form so cruel that we shrink from thinking about it under the hoofs of his surging and plunging herd, might be waiting for him out yonder on the prairie, or be lurking at the base of the steep bank of a sandy riverbed, mile or two farther away, over which he and many of his cattle were likely to plunge to a common fate. Many of the employers of these men were either non-residents or dwellers in the towns or cities of the states and territories in which their herds were located. Oh, they might visit their ranches and remain for a few days once or twice a year, but at all their times, their property was wholly in the keeping of their cowboys, under the direction of a foreman or manager, who usually was a man who had been promoted from the ranks. The success of the enterprises and even the preservation of the large capital invested in them were, so far as the conduct of affairs on the range determined these, depended on the faithfulness and the prompt attention to duty under all the circumstances of the foreman and his cowboys. In the history of the cattle range, the instances of failure to meet these exacting requirements are few and far between. Among these men, there were a great many of good address and some of excellent education, young fellows who had struck out into the West to take their chances with fortune. Whatever they may have been or done in their town, they were as a class frank, honorable, and hospitable when on the range, although they were disposed to be quiet and reserved in their manners in the presence of strangers. But, as a rule, their silent ways were not those of moroseness. In most of them, there was a grave, unostentatious courtesy toward a visitor, this being particularly noticeable in those of the South, to visitors who had come from that part of the country. Their reserve, however, fell away in their association with each other, and when a number of them were gathered around a campfire, or at ranch headquarters, or at a roundup, they were lively enough among themselves, and in their stories, sallies, and railleries, there was as much coarseness of language. But no more than one would hear among an equal number of miners in a western mining town. Perhaps not so much, and certainly it would not be heard so often. They were strongly disposed to be clannish, and while there were occasional feuds between individuals that usually ended in death of one or the other, sometimes both, as a body of men, they would fight for each other to the last. The cowboy was not a garrulous person. He had developed to a remarkable degree the faculty of expressing himself in the terse, crisp, clear-cut language of the range, and when he spoke, his hearers had no good reason for misunderstanding his meaning. The long-winded and pompous speeches that have been attributed to men of his calling in some of the late-time stories of the range would have turned gray the hair of the old-timer had he been forced into an attempt to get them off. Under reasonable provocations, he was a profane man. Few, even among his most ardent partisans, would undertake to controvert this assertion. But he did not depend upon the commonplace, shop-worn terms of the town plotter. However, it is to be said that it was an uncommon thing for him to break forth with his full powers without fair justification. For this purpose he had most astonishing vocabulary, and in dealing with a detestable range horse, or in striving to make a half-wild, long-horned, obstinate steer behave himself and go the way that he should, nothing but its vigorous employ appeared to fit the circumstances of the case. For use upon such occasions, and also upon sundry others, every well-equipped cowboy of the old times had acquired and kept at his command what appeared to be the entire resources of the Anglo-Saxon speech that could be worked into phrases of denunciation, and they are not few in number. And when he intermingled with these an assortment of picturesque and glowing Spanish expletives and terms of opprobrium, as he frequently did, the earth trembled. But he also had vocal resources other and quite different from those of profanity for use in his rough business. Often at night, when his cattle became restive under the mutterings of a coming storm, or uneasy from some unseen cause, or from the darkness of an overclouded sky, and even when on stampede, he would sing to them. The sound of the human voice and melody, however rude this might have been, usually had, under such circumstances, a soothing, assuring, and quieting effect upon the half-wild, apprehensive beasts. It's not worthwhile here to discuss the whys and wherefores of it, but it had such an effect. The cowboy made no pretensions to an elaborate repertoire. When an occasion arose for doing so, he sang, or tried to sing, such songs as he happened to know as well as he could. Usually he knew some church tunes, lingering reminiscences of his boyhood away off somewhere toward sunrise, for as a cowboy he seldom ever saw a church from afar, to say nothing of going inside of one. Sometimes he recalled the words or part of them that went with these tunes and used them to the best advantage. The music of Old Hundred and music and words of I Would Not Live Always were favorites on the range in times of threatening trouble. But oftener the cowboy improvised words for these and other church tunes, or adapted to them those of some doggerel song he knew. It was all the same to him. The cattle were affected by the music, not by the words, and to give them the music was what he was trying to do. But occasionally among these men an exquisite voice was heard, and when one of these was raised, the restless cattle listened to the most of real music. Still, the typical old-time cowboy hardly be called a singing man. There'd be too much strenuousness in his life for that. So it was not very often that the vocal music, or any other kind for that matter, was heard in a cow camp or ranch headquarters. It happened sometimes that the curiosity of range stock became aroused by the singing of men at night, and animals would draw and look on as well as listen. The French missionary, the Abbé Dominic, tells as follows of an early incident of this kind that occurred in 1849, while he was on one of his journeys over the valley of the Colorado River of Texas. It was our last night for sleeping on the plains, and this idea heightened our good humor. Pipes were lighted, conversations became animated. We wrapped our cloaks about us, looked up to the heavens, and sang in concert such as memory recalled of the hymns and melodies with which were familiar to us in our childhood. At 2 o'clock in the morning we ceased singing. But what was our surprise on finding that we were surrounded by Americans, Irishmen, and Mexicans who had drawn near to hear us sing. Behind them we saw a regular troop of horses and oxen and cattle forming a circle around us, having also, no doubt, been attracted by our singing. The herd is brought upon its herd ground and carefully watched during the day, but allowed to scatter out over sufficient territory to feed. At nightfall, it is gathered to a spot selected near the tent, and there rounded up and held during the night. One or more cowboys are on duty all the while, being relieved at regular hours by relays fresh aroused from slumber and mounted on rested ponies. And for a given number of hours, they ride slowly and quietly around the herd, which, soon as it is dusk, lies down to rest and ruminate. About midnight, every animal will arise, turn about for a few moments, and then lie down again near where it rose, only changing sides so as to rest. But if no one should be watching to prevent straggling, it would be but a short time before the entire herd would be up and following off the leader, or some uneasy one that would rather travel than sleep or rest. All this is easily checked by the cowboy on duty. But when storm is imminent, every man is required to have his horse saddled ready for an emergency. The ponies desired for use are picketed out, which is done by tying one end of a half-inch rope, 60 or 70 feet long, around the neck of the pony, and fastening the other end to a pointed iron or wooden stake, 12 or more inches long, which is driven into firm ground. As all the strain is lateral and none upward, the picket pin will hold the strongest horse. The length of the rope is such as to permit the animal to graze over considerable space, and when he has all the grass eaten within his reach, it's only necessary to move the picket pin to give him fresh and abundant pasture. Such surplus ponies are not in immediate use, and they're permitted to run with the cattle or herded to themselves. And when one becomes jaded by hard usage, he's turned loose and the rested one is caught up with the lasso and put to service. Nearly all cowboys can throw the lasso well enough to capture a pony or a beef when they desire to do so. Day after day, the cattle are held under the herd and cared for by the cowboys, whilst the drover is looking out for a purchaser for his herd or a part thereof, especially if it be a mixed herd, which is a drove composed of beeves, 3, 2, and 1-year-old steers, heifers, and cows. To those desiring any one or more classes of such stock as he may have, the drover seeks to sell, and, if successful, has the herd rounded up and cut out the class to sold. And after counting carefully until all parties are satisfied, straightway delivers them to the purchaser. The counting of the cattle, like the separating or cutting out, is invariably done on horseback. Those who do the counting take positions a score of paces apart, whilst the cowboys cut off small detachments of cattle and force them between those counting, and when the bunch or cut is counted satisfactorily, the operation is repeated until all are counted. Another method is to start the herd off, and when it's well drawn out, to begin at the head and count back until the last are numbered. As a rule, stock cattle are sold by the herd, and often beeves are sold in the same manner, but in many instances, sale is made by pound or gross weight. The latter manner is much the safest for the experienced, for he then pays only for what he gets. But the Texan prefers to sell just as he buys at home, always by the head. However, in late years, it is becoming nearly the universal custom to weigh all beef sold in northern markets. While the herd is being held upon the same grazing grounds, often one or more of the cowboys not on duty will mount their ponies and go to the village nearest the camp and spend a few hours, learn of all the items of news or gossip concerning other herds and the cowboys belonging thereto. Besides seeing the sights, he gets such little articles as he may be wanting by himself and comrades at the camp. Of these, a supply of tobacco, both chewing and smoking, forms one of the principal and often recurring wants. The cowboy almost invariably smokes or chews tobacco, generally both, for the time that drags dull at the camp on herd grounds. There's nothing new or exciting occurring to break the monotony of daily routine events. Sometimes the cowboys off duty will go to town late in the evening, and there join with some party of cowboys, whose herd is sold, and they're preparing to start home and having a jolly good old time. Often, one or more of them will imbibe too much poison whiskey and straightway go on the warpath. Then, mounting his pony, he's ready to shoot anybody or anything, or rather than not shot at all, would fire up into the air, all the while yelling as only a semi-civilized being can. At such times, it's not safe to be on the streets, or for that matter within a house, for the drunken cowboy would as soon shoot into a house as anything else. Many incidents could be told of these crazy freaks, and freaks more villainous than crazy, but space forbids, say one only. In 1868, a party of young men, mostly residents of Abilene, numbering 6 or 7, were returning from a walk at a late hour when all of a sudden they heard the footsteps of a running pony, each moment coming nearer. Before they could scarce divine the meaning thereof, a mounted, crazy, drunken cowboy was upon them, yelling in demoniacal voice to halt, adding horrible oaths, abuse, and insult. Before the young men fully comprehended the situation, the cowboy was rushing around them at a furious rate of speed, firing both his revolvers over their heads in the darkness, demanding an immediate contribution from each one of them of a $10 note, swearing instant death to everyone who refused to comply at once with his request. The party of young men was entirely unarmed and in imminent danger of being shot. But no time was to be lost. As a subterfuge, one of the young men that drove her began talking in the kindest tone of voice, saying to the cowboy, "Now hold on. We're all cowboys just off the trail and have been out to see a little fun. We have no money with us, but if you'll go with me to the cottage, you shall have all the $10 notes you want." Certainly, sir. Anything you want you can have, if only you'll go with me to the hotel." Certainly, sir." Whilst this was being played, each of the other boys betook himself to his hands and knees and crawled away in the darkness until a few paces were gained, then tried his utmost capacity in running to a place of safety. In the meantime, the cowboy followed the spokesman, swearing instant death to everyone if the money was not forthcoming. No sooner did they reach the cottage than the young drover, after reassuring the cowboy of his intentions to get him the money, passed inside the hotel and at once rushed for his pistol. But friends who comprehended his intent and seeing shoot in his eyes prevented him from going outside again. The cowboy, having his suspicions aroused by the delay, whirled his pony and dashed off for the village, screeching and yelling in genuine Indian style as he went. Coming to a large open-fronted tent, he dashed toward it, emptying the last loaded chamber of his revolver into it, then drawing his huge knife, cut the tent from end to end, and when it had fallen to the ground at his feet, rushed his pony over it, and was off for a bagnio where he robbed every inmate of their money, jewelry, and other valuables, then turned his pony's head towards the cattle trail and was off for Texas. Such hard cases made it necessary to institute corporate governing in the village. It was a hard struggle before law and order was established, and to maintain it cost the utmost firmness and perpetual vigilance. It was often necessary to disarm drunken cowboys and such roughs as inevitably congregate at frontier commercial centers, which could be done only by force and terror. No quiet man would turn or care to take the office of marshal, which jeopardized his life, hence the necessity of employing a desperado, one who feared nothing and would soon shoot out an offending subject as to look at him. The life of the cowboy in camp is routine and dull. His food is largely of the regulation order, but a feast of vegetables he wants and must have or scurvy would ensue. Onions and potatoes are his favorites, but any kind of vegetable will disappear in haste when put within his reach. In camp, on the trail, or on the ranch, in Texas, where there are countless thousands of cattle, milk and butter are almost unknown. Not even milk or cream for the coffee is had. Pure shiftlessness and lack of energy are the only reasons for this privation, and to the same reason can be assigned much of the privations and hardships incident to ranching. It would cost but little effort or expense to add 100 comforts, not to say luxuries, to the life of a drover and his cowboys. They sleep on the ground with a pair of blankets for a bed and cover. No tent is used, scarcely any cooking utensils, and such a thing as a camp cook stove is unknown. The warm water of the branch or the standing pool is drank, often in its yellow with alkali and other poisons. No wonder the cowboy gets sallow and unhealthy and deteriorates in manhood until often he becomes capable of any contemptible thing. No wonder he should become half civilized only and take to whiskey with a love excelled scarcely by the barbarous Indian. When the herd is sold and delivered to the purchaser, a day of rejoicing to the cowboys has come, for then he can go free and have a jolly time. And it is a jolly time they have. Straightway after settling with their employers, The barbershop is visited, and 3 to 6 months' growth of hair is shorn off, and their long-grown, sunburnt beards set in due shape and properly blacked. Next, a clothing story of the Israelitish style is gone through, and the cowboy emerges a new man in outward appearance. Everything being new, not excepting the hat and boots, with star decorations about the tops, also new. Well, in short, everything new. Then for fun and frolic, the bar room, the theater, the gambling room, the bawdy house, the dance hall, each and all come in for their full share of attention. In any of these places, an affront or a slight or real or imaginary is cause sufficient for him to unlimber one or more mountain howitzers, invariably found strapped to his person, and proceed to deal out death in unbroken doses to such as may be in range of his pistols. Whether real friends or enemies, no matter, his anger and bad whiskey urge him on to deeds of blood and death. At frontier towns, where are centered many cattle, and as a natural result, considerable business is transacted, and many strangers congregate there, are always to be found in a number of bad characters, both male and female, of the very worst class in the universe, such as have fallen below the level of the lowest type of brute creation. Men who live a soulless, aimless life dependent upon the turn of a card for the means of a living. They wear out a purposeless life, ever looking bleary-eyed and dissipated, to whom life, from various causes, has long since become worse than a total blank, being in the form of a man whose outward appearance would betoken gentleman, but whose heartstrings are but a wisp of bass-sounding chords, upon which the touch of the higher and purer life have long since ceased to be felt. Being without whom the world would be better, richer, and more desirable. And with them are always found the counterparts in the opposite sex, those who have fallen low. Alas, how low! They too are found in the frontier cattle town, and that institution known in the West as a dance house is there found also. When the darkness of the night is come to shroud their orgies from public gaze, these miserable beings gather in the halls of the dance hall and trip the fantastic toe to wretched music ground out in a dilapidated instrument by being fully as degraded as the most vile. In this vortex of dissipation, the average cowboy plunges with great delight. Few more wild, reckless scenes of abandon and debauchery can be seen on the civilized earth than a dance house in full blast in one of the many frontier towns. To say they dance wildly or in an abandoned manner is putting it mild. Their manner of practicing the terpsichorean art would put the French can-can to shame. The cowboy enters the dance with a peculiar zest, not stopping to divest himself of his sombrero, spurs, or pistols, but just as he dismounts off his cow pony, so he goes into the dance. A more odd, not to say comical sight is not often seen than the dancing cowboy with the front of his sombrero lifted at the angle of full 45 degrees, his huge spurs jingling at every step or motion, his revolver flapping up and down like a retreating sheep's tail, his eyes lit up with excitement, liquor, and lust. He plunges in and hoes it down at a terrible rate in the most approved yet awkward country style, often swinging his partner clear off the floor for an entire circle, then balance all with an occasional demoniacal yell near akin to a war whoop of the savage Indian. All this he does entirely oblivious to the whole world and the balance of mankind. After dancing furiously, the entire set is called Waltz to the Bar, where the boy is required to treat his partner, and of course himself also, which he does not hesitate to do time and again, although it cost him 50 cents each time. Yet, if it cost 10 times that amount, he would not hesitate, but the more he dances and drinks, the less common sense he will have, and the more completely his animal passions will control him. Such is the manner in which the cowboy spends his hard-earned dollars. And such is the entertainment that many young men from the North and the South, of superior parentage and youthful advantage in life, give themselves up to. And often more, their lives are made to pay the forfeit of their sinful foolishness. After a few days of frolic and debauchery, the cowboy is ready in company with his comrades to start back to Texas, often not having $1 left of his summer wages. To this rather hard-drawn picture of the cowboy, there are many creditable exceptions. Young men who respect themselves and save their money, and are worthy young gentlemen. But it is idle to deny the fact that the wild, reckless conduct of the cowboys, while drunk, in connection with that of the worthless northern renegades, have brought the personnel of the Texan cattle trade into great disrepute. And finally, many graves with victims, bad men and good men, at Abilene, Newton, Wichita, and Ellsworth. But by far, the larger portion of those killed are of that class that could be spared without detriment to the good morals and respectability of humanity. It often occurs when the cowboys fail to get up a melee and kill each other by the half dozen that the keepers of those hell's half acres find some pretext arising from business jealousies or other causes to suddenly become belligerent and stop not to declare war but to begin hostilities at once. It is a generally effective work they do with their revolvers and shotguns, for they are the most desperate men on earth. Either some of the principals or their subordinates are generally done in for a thorough manner or wounded so as to be miserably crippled for life. On such occasions there are few tears shed or even inquiries made by the respectable people, but an expression of sorrow is common that active hostilities do not continue until every rough was stone dead. In writing on the subject of life on a Texas ranch, W.S. James says, "I don't wish it understood that there is any cast iron rule by which one shall judge of the manners and the customs of the cowman. For customs changes on the range as it does in every other section. The methods of work and customs differ as widely in different localities as do the dress of women. And if this is not giving a sufficiently wide range, I don't know how to express it. The ranches in southern Colorado and western New Mexico, as well as in the panhandle of Texas, were conducted on widely different plans. To the rancher in the middle in the western states, and again in the southern part of the states, there was a marked difference. I'm treating of the special features of ranch life as noticeable in central and western Texas, being the range with which I was most familiar. It is true I had some experience in various ranges and more observations than actual experience, but my substantial knowledge is confined to the locality above named. While the cattleman is not a straight edge, he has no cast iron rule as the guide of his life in handling cattle. Still, take him wherever you find him, and he is much the same in many respects. Many people think that cowboy is an ignoramus as far as books are concerned, and many of them have had but meager advantages. But many more have been educated in some of the best institutions in the country. One of the 9 young men, the oldest of the squad being 28, who were lounging around a campfire one evening or night, as it is termed in the South, after supper, singing, telling stories, and having such a jolly time as can only be enjoyed round a campfire when everyone is duly sober, and the conversation turned upon education. And it was ascertained by taking stock that 5 out of the 9 had graduated in Eastern colleges, 2 of the 5 being UV graduates, and every one of the remaining 4 having enjoyed the advantages of a common school education. Yet his education is not especially in letters, except as they are used for brands on cattle. Neither is it simply from A to Z in lines. It's an all-round up and down, over and under, and between. Wherever you strike him, he is at home and he knows his lesson. They are unlike some people to be met with in life who pass current as scholars, but when taken out of their books, don't know straight up. The cowboy goes to the school of nature, learns his lesson from observation and practical experience. He goes by no stipulated rules, cuts no square corners, but takes his bearing and goes straight on. This is the general rule, to which there are always exceptions. The manners and practices of different men in camp are as varied as anywhere on earth. Some men are good at one thing and not good at another. Some are careless of their personal appearance, while others are very careful. But if they fall into lines anywhere, it is a point of dress. Even the cook will fall into wearing good clothes, especially a good hat, good boots, good pants, and overshirt. One man we had in our outfit for years was fit for nothing under the sun but to break our saddle horses. I mean to ride them the first few days until they were sufficiently gentle to be ridden by less adventurous hands. But after a horse was once manageable, he was utterly out of place on him. We kept him because he was the best rider that ever took to work on the ranch. But the fellow, after a horse was bridle-wise, would absolutely go to sleep riding around, and sometimes a half-tame horse would suddenly take flight and began bucking. But he always kept his seat. I never, for the 13 years I was associated with him, knew him to be thrown from a horse. When we had no horses to handle, if we worked him at all, he was on herd. Then it took one good hand and a boy part of the time to keep him awake. This, of course, is metaphorically speaking. Some men were good in holding a herd while cutting. Some were good in cutting, some good in branding, and a majority who stayed with the business were good all-round men. I mean by that, good most anywhere you put them except the cook. He was the cook. Some few good hands went on a roundup and in general work were no good in camp. Sometimes there would be no special cook and each would or was supposed to do his part, but they did not always do it. Some men would ride a tired horse into camp, take off the saddle, throw it on the ground just as it came handiest, maybe horn down, throw the wet blankets down on top of it all in a bunch, hopple him, pull the bridle off, and slash the poor fellow across the back with a bridle rein, thus forcing him to jump his poor tired bones out of range. Usually a man of this type would drop down in the shade of the grub wagon or some tree to begin order the cook around. My observation has been that the man of this character never in the long run made a success in the cattle business. If he did, it was the exception and was attributed to range luck. Another character would ride up, remove his saddle, hang it up, or spread the skirt, spread his blankets, lead his panting pony in the grass, hobble him, smooth his mane, speak kindly to him, remove the bridle, and come whistling or singing into camp. Lay his bridle down and look around to see if the water was out or anything short. He would roll up his sleeves and, speaking kindly to the cook, fly in and help the fellow out. The busiest time on a ranch is the preparation for the spring roundups. There are saddles to mend, hobbles to make, grub wagons to overhaul, and horses to get in shape, shoeing and trimming up, quirts to make, ropes to straighten up, and planning till you can't rest. As there had been so much said and written about a roundup and so many exaggerated stories of riding bronco ponies, I shall leave that for others to relate. Suffices to say, out of everything that has been or can be written, one can have a very inaccurate idea of the reality until he's been there and has witnessed it for himself. But if you can draw on your imagination for a picture, I'll try to give you what you can see. And if you was to drive up to a ranch and find them making preparations for a roundup, I give it as I saw it last. Driving in front from the north over a prairie country with now and then a grove of trees, we picked our way down a winding hollow or ravine for 1.5 miles, sometimes on one side of the hollow and then on the other. Finally, we came out in the open valley that stretches for a mile or more down to the creek on either side. Just on the opposite bank of the little creek stood the ranch house, the branding pens off to the west. In front of the house stood the old grub wagon that had done service for years, with the barrel securely fastened to one side, the grub box sitting the hindmost end of the bed, with its shelves and doors that dropped open. The cook is now busy cleaning it out, Johnny, God bless him. In fancy, I see him now as he stood there with sleeves rolled up, his pants turned up at the bottom. He'd been working so hard the sweat was rolling off his dear old face. He was one of the best-hearted fellows I ever knew, one in whom the milk of human kindness was the predominant trait of character, and whose many virtues made him a universal favorite. He has long since gone to those pastures green. Just beyond and in front of the wagon stood one of the boys, plaiting a whip. Astride the tongue of the wagon was Charlie, mending his saddle, singing as was his habit when busy. Out at the end of the house, one of the boys was scraping some rawhide for hopples, and down the valley, perhaps 100 yards away, one of the boys came leisurely driving some ponies, some of which still had the hobbles on, being too rollicky to allow them to take them off. Out on the woodpile, two of the outfit were earnestly trying to make a horse trade, while the remainder of the boys were in the pen, branding some horses before starting out. Now, if you wish to know it better, just go down and see for yourself, which you will hardly do, as that had been 16 years ago and everything had so changed as to make such a thing almost an impossibility. It is rather singular how ranches are named. It is true that many ranches bear the name of the owners, as the Keith Ranch, Stone Ranch, Campbell and Martin Ranch, etc. But many more go exclusively by the name of the brand, as the Cross L Ranch, X and L, the B4 Ranch, B and 4, the Diamond Ranch with a diamond symbol, the Blocker Ranch with a block and an R, the Flower de Lou Ranch, the Booth Ranch, the Boot Ranch, the Saddler Ranch, simple saddle with an R. The naming of horses was, as a rule, accidental. A new horse let fly had kicked at one of the boys. He went by the name of Heels until he passed in his chips. Another horse we had that had a habit of kicking never had any name but Dirty Heels. A little colt of fine blood that was left motherless and had to be raised on a bottle happened to come under the special care of one of the children, who one day remarked that it would be a wonder if he lived. He was called Wonder. The same horse was sold for $300. He still remained a wonder. If an outfit bought a horse from a Granger, the horse almost invariably bore the name of his former owner. No difference how ugly it was. For illustration, we had one horse we got by a man named Kaiser, and Kaiser was his name. One of them, Mr. Dickey, and Dickey was his name. We had one that would put his teeth to a rail, tree, or stump and draw as though he was sucking. We called him the Sucker. I might take your precious time for a week and then not finish, so I won't go any further on that one. In naming creeks, a chance circumstance would forever settle it. Father had a tussle with a wounded deer, a very large buck, one morning, and the deer gave a peculiar whistle or snort so common to them. The little hollow was and is until this day called buck snort. The boy had been out for some weeks and run out of bread. The man they sent for it was delayed on account of rain and swollen streams, having to go 60 miles. We were camped on a little spring branch and had been living on beef straight for several days. When our man came driving in with plenty of grub, the little hollow was ever afterwards called Happy Hollow. I knew a pony called Happy Jack because of his contented disposition and his propensity to run and romp. Men were often nicknamed in the same way, but oftener from some peculiarity in their personal appearance. One man who measured 6.5 feet and weighed but 135 pounds was called Shorty. On the contrary, another one was only 5 feet 4 inches we called Legs. A fellow who was extremely bow-legged we called Shanks. The cook, as a rule, was called Sally. One fellow who sometimes tried to preach, and who, by the way, we recognized and respected by all the boys as a good man, while on a roundup allowed himself to become so excited one day as to secure the sobriquet of Yaller. It came about in this way. We were traveling across a mountainous district, and some of the boys off to the left side of the herd started a very large bear. Several of them joined in the chase, among them the preacher, who was riding an old yellow horse. As he was passing one of the boys, he was heard to say, "Get up and get, Yaller. God bless you, get up and get." Some of the boys were sacrilegious enough to change it from Sunday school language to something not so nice, but we didn't credit it. However, he was ever after called Old Yaller. He killed the bear just the same. I call no names in these short sketches, as many as the dear old boy living, and I would not wish to make public any property that is or has been so long our own private stock in trade. Many of the men of whom I speak have gone from this to the better world. When the eternal spring shall come, where it never withers grass, when the great herald shall announce the final great roundup, it is to be hoped that the dear old boys will not all be turned into the left-handed gate as strays to be gobbled up by the thief of human souls, but that they may be found to bear the Master's brand, an earmark of the Redeemer of the Lord. If there is any one thing that has engaged the mind of the majority of the human family more than another in the past, it is the question of their personal appearance and style of fashion has been as changeable as Texas weather, and I dare say the locality and peculiar people that never change style are the exception. If one should wish to know anything about the rural district of old Mexico, they would have to go back 4,000 or 5,000 years and read in Genesis, but only give them time and they too will change. In the mountains of the eastern Tennessee and the swamps of Louisiana and Arkansas, as well as the piney woods of eastern Texas, They have changed from the old flintlock to the cap and ball gun. And some of them have quit making their own clothes and wear store-bought clothes because it is stylish now to wear brown duck instead of jeans. The cowboy is no exception to the rule. He's had his flights of fancy as clearly defined as the most fashionable French belle. In 1867, I remember distinctly the style that prevailed: flowing to fenders, narrow stirrup, and rider stood on his toe. The saddle at the time was almost anything that could be had, but preferably the broad horn standing at an angle of 45 degrees, pointing heavenward. The bridle was hardly to be called a creation of fancy, as it was all they had, and was made from the hide of a cow, rubbed and grinded until it was pliable. Some men broke the monotony by adopting the Mexican plan of making them of hair, which is a very popular article of which to make ropes. Some made their bridles of rawhide by plaiting or braiding, which made quite an artistic one. Some would plait the quirt on the end of the rein. The rope used for catching and handling horses and cattle was plaited one end, and that was the best rope for the purpose I ever used. I have seen a few ropes that were very good, made of rawhide, with 3 strands twisted and run together. In fact, during and for several years after the war, long after Reconstruction days in Texas, it was said, and not without some foundation, that a Texan could take a butcher knife and rawhide and make a steamboat out of it. Of course, he could not have made the boiler, but when it came to the top part, he would have been at home. One thing's certain: if the thing broke into pieces, he could have tied it up. During the war, his clothing was made from homespun cloth. He had no other. Homemade shoes or boots. Even his hat was homemade, the favorite hat material being straw. Now, rye straw was the best. Now, sometimes a fellow would get hold of a Mexican hat, and then he was sailing. The popular way for protecting the clothing was to make a leather cap for the knee and seat of the pants, and the more enterprising would make leggings of calfskin, hair out, and sometimes buckskin with fringe down the side. But in 1872, most everything on the ranch had undergone a change. Even some of the boys had changed their range headquarters for sunnier climes because they had to. Some had sold out to a lawyer and had taken a contract from the state. Others had changed their spurs and leggings for a crown, harp, and wings and gone to pastures green, perhaps. But especially had style changed: the wool hat, the leather leggings, leather brindle, and broad stirrup. The invention, an old fellow who lived in Llano River, had become so popular that one was not provided with them was not in style. The stirrups was from 6 to 8 inches broad, and the rider drew his leather so as to ride with legs crooked up considerably. The saddle used with one with broad flat horn, much higher in front than behind, adorned with saddle pockets, covered with either goat or bear skin. The spur, too, was another article that changed. The long shank with bells had taken the place of the little straight shank and sharp rowel, the longer ones making a curve downward and having long teeth rowels. In this age of the cowman, they wore buckskin gloves with long gauntlets. The style changed again by 77. The John B. Stetson hat with a deeper crown and not so broad a rim, and the 10-ounce hat took the cake. Up to this date, the high-heeled boots were the rage, and when it was possible to have them, the heel was made to start under the foot, for what reason I never knew, unless it was the same motive that prompts the girls to wear the opera heel in order to make a small track, thus leaving the impression that a number 10 was only a 6. This I'm guessing at, and we'll leave it open for the reader to draw to. But the last named dates, 77 or 78, the cowman had in many places adopted the box-toed boot with sensible heels, and the California saddle was taking the place of all others. This was an extremely heavy saddle with a small horn, but very strong, and the most comfortable saddle to be found for steady use, and as a rule, the easiest one on a horse. There was another saddle, a Texas production, closely allied to the Bucaria, but not so heavy, and it is to this day a very popular saddle. The slicker and tarpaulin were 2 of the most valuable accessions to the cowman's outfit that ever came into the business. They were made of good cotton stuff, and a preparation of linseed oil filled every pore so completely that they were as thoroughly waterproof as a shingled roof, and became the cowboy's right bower. A cowboy's outfit is never complete except that he has a good supply of hopples on hand. After seagrass ropes became so plentiful and cheap, the good old rawhide hopples and plaited lariats were relegated to the rear. And if the cowpony could talk, unless he was a good religious cowpony, he'd curse the day when seagrass hopples were introduced. His feelings toward the invention of this article would be something like that of the native towards the barbed wire manufacturer, for the poor little fellow sometimes wore a very sore pair of legs by the use of the strands of the rope for a hopple. Now, there's been much said about pack ponies and that method of working a range by taking grub on a pack. Some very amusing things will occur with the pack. I remember once while driving through Waco, the pack pony became a little unruly and he was running up and down the street after street with the pack slipped and turned under. This put the little gentleman to kicking. The result was that the flour, bacon, beans, tin cups and plates, coffee pot, sugar, onions, and bedding were strewn over about 5 acres of ground. Some of the boys suggested that we hire the ground broke and harrow it before it rained and thus secure a good crop of grub. Now, the pack pony was very handy, but he was the greatest trouble of any one thing in the outfit. And it was the most cruel thing imaginable to fasten the pack on so as to make it secure, even with a saddle. And to fasten it well, let the pony or donkey, as the case may be, run into a pond of water and get the ropes wet. It was terrible on him. When one outfit had to resort to a pack, they usually hired their bread maid or made it sometimes when they couldn't find a woman, not infrequently making it up in the mouth of the sack. And if they had no skillet, would either fry it or cook it hoe cake fashion. But I've seen it cooked by rolling the dough around a stick and holding it over a fire, turning it until cooked. The change in the style of saddles brought the change also in the stirrup. Since '78 and the introduction of the California saddle, the narrow stirrup had been used and had been found to be the most comfortable. The change in position of the legs, too, accompanied this change in fashion. The foot is thrust through the stirrup until the stirrup rests in the hollow of the foot, or the foot rests thus in the stirrup just as you like. And when the rider sits in his saddle, the straps are lengthened so as to let him rest his weight just comfortably in the stirrup, while at the same time he is not removed from the saddle seat. It has been fully demonstrated that the man who rides thus and sits straight on his horse is capable of riding farther and with less fatigue to himself and the horse than one who is all the time changing. The methods of handling cattle change as well as the paraphernalia. I remember it was a rare thing ever to see a man branding cattle on horseback. If they did, they usually threw the rope on the animal's head and then tied them to a tree and heeled them or threw the rope around their hind legs and simply stretched them out. In branding yearlings or calves on the range, they would make a run, toss the tug on the animal. One man would hold while another would dismount, catch it by the tail, jerk it down, draw its tail between its hind legs, place his knee against its back while it would be lying on its side, and thus hold it while the first man would brand and mark it. In the way described above, one man could hold the largest animal on the range, if he understood his business. Range branding was a very popular method of branding mavericks. The necessary outfit usually was a sharp knife, a straight bar, and a half circle. The ring end of a wagon rod or common iron rings were good. The coming of the barbed wire fence and the railroad killed the cowboy as a picturesque element of recklessness and lawlessness in southwest Texas. It suppressed him and localized him and limited him to his own range, and it made his revolver merely an ornament. Before the barbed wire fence appeared, the cattle wandered from one range to another, and the man of 15,000 acres would overstock, knowing that when his cattle could not find enough pasturage on his range, they'd just move over to the range of his more prosperous neighbor. Consequently, when the men who could afford it began to fence their ranges, the smaller owners who had overbred saw that their cattle would starve. And so they cut the fences in order to get back to the pastures where they'd been used to so long. This and the shutting off of water tanks and of long-used trails brought on a barbed wire fence war which raged long and fiercely between the cowboys and the fencemen of rival ranches and the Texas Rangers. The barbed wire fences did more than this. They shut off the great trails that stretched from Corpus Christi through the panhandle of Texas and on up through New Mexico and Colorado and through Indian Territory to Dodge City. The coming of the railroads also made this trailing of cattle to the markets superfluous and almost destroyed one of the most remarkable features of the West. This trail was not, of course, an actual trail and marked as such, but a general driveway 40 miles wide and thousands of miles long. The herds of cattle that were driven over it numbered from 300 to 3,000 head and were moving constantly from the early spring to the late fall. The West has changed. The old days are gone. The house dog sits on the hill where yesterday's coyote sang. The fences are short and small, and within them grow green things instead of gray. There are many smokes now rising over the prairie, and they're wide and black instead of thin and blue. As we look out into the evening light from where we stand, we may see the long, shining parallels of the iron trail reaching out into the sunset. A little busy town lies near, flanked with fields of grain ready for the harvesting. There are cattle, but not those of the deformed aspect which Corona saw when he walked across this country in the gray of other days, but sleek, round beasts, which stand deep in crops their ancestors never saw. In the little town is the hurry and the bustle of modern life, even here upon the extreme edge of the well-settled lands. For this is in the West, or what is now known as the West. It is far out upon what may now, as well as any place, be called the frontier, though really the frontier is gone. Guarding its ghost, watching over its grave, here stands a little army post, once one of the pillars, now one of the monuments of the West. The routine of the uncomplaining men who made the army go on there still as it does over the land. One had seen the forming of troops today, the view over there upon the parade ground. As evening comes, he can hear the song of the trumpets, music that tingle in his hair. As the sun drops to the edge of the plains, there comes the boom of a cannon at the fort, and the fluttering down its staff falls the flag, which waves over east and west and south and north alike, over the present and the past. Out from the little settlement in the dusk of the evening, always being toward where the sun is sinking, rides a figure we should know. He threads the little lane among the fences, following the guidance of hands other than his own, a thing he would once have scorned to do. He rides as lightly and as easily as ever, sitting erect and jaunty in the saddle, his reins held high and loose in the hand whose fingers turned up daintily, his whole body free yet firm in the saddle, with the seat of a perfect horseman. His hat still sweeps up and back in careless freedom of fashion. It is dusk, and we may not see his trappings. Let us hope his belt is still about his waist, his spurs still jingling as he rides. His pony is the same, or much the same as when we saw it many years ago, coming up the street of a very different town. It trots steadily forward with the easy movement of the animal accustomed to long distances. The two, man and horse, show up strongly in the unreal light of evening on the plains. They seem to rise and move strangely as one looks, seem to grow strangely large and indistinct. Yet they melt and soften and so define, and at length as the red sun sinks quite to the level of the earth, the figures of both show plainly and with no touch of harshness upon the western sky. The cowboy, as he rides on, jaunty, erect, virile, strong, with his eyes fixed perhaps on the ridge miles away, from which presently there may shine a small red light to hold his gaze, now looks about him at the buildings of the little town. As the boom of the cannon comes and the flag drops fluttering down to sleep, he rises in his stirrup and waves his hat to the flag. Then, towards the edge, out into the evening, he rides on. The dust of his riding mingles with the dust of the night. We cannot see which is the one or the other. We can only hear the hoofbeats passing, boldly and steadily still, but growing fainter, fainter, and more faint.